All right, so let me get my screen share started here. And we'll pop this up on the screen. Here we go. Okay, can you see that all right there, Derek?
Yep, that's perfect.
Lovely. Okay. Before I start anything, I want to say Happy Earth Day to everyone. It's obviously a very special day. I'm really happy that I'm actually getting to talk about this on Earth Day. The other thing too I want to bring up before I sort of even get into my title slide is that on Sunday, the 25th of April, it is World Penguin Day. So those of you who are on social media, you should be able to see a fair amount of hubbub around World Penguin Day. Some of the partners that I work with at Oxford University, these are the folks at Penguin Watch, they're hosting a whole slew of online activities on Sunday. So if you're on Twitter or on Facebook, if you look up Penguin Watch, you'll be able to find a whole bunch of stuff that they're doing this Sunday for World Penguin Day. So please do get around doing that because they're a great group of people. Okay, and with that, I am incredibly thrilled today to get the opportunity to talk to you guys and to record this to discuss something I'm incredibly passionate about, and that is counting penguins, something that I've been doing for about 7 years now. So before I really kick off here, I want to just make a couple of comments. First is thank you to everyone who's tuning in today, whether that be on YouTube or on Zoom. And for those who you might be watching this recorded version in the future, it's really great to be able to share this with you. Also, I want to shout out to the students at Cabri School, the Cabri Primary School in Saskatchewan, Canada, who are listening in today. I think we've got grades 1, 2, and 3 who are listening in. And it's really great that we've got some school groups who are listening into this and showing some interest in penguin science. So I'm really excited to have you here. So I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about who I am, and not necessarily describing my academic credentials, but I really want to talk about what motivates me and where I come from. So I was born in Newfoundland, which is an island on the east coast of Canada. For those of you who don't know where Newfoundland is or have never been there, I highly recommend checking it out and going because it is a spectacular place. But growing up on an island meant that I was surrounded by the ocean. I lived, on and around the ocean in various ways, shapes, and forms growing up. Spent time in boats and a lot of family who come from a fishing background and the like. And as a young kid, my dad spent a lot of time showing me, raptors mostly. Used to spend a lot of time pointing out ospreys and hawks and eagles as we were driving up the roads. Sometime on backyard birds and all this sort of stuff. And that really spurred my interest in ornithology as a young child. That combined with always being surrounded. Oh, sorry, I've just made a big mess of things as my lamp has fallen down. But yeah, that really spurred my interest in ornithology as a young child. Over the years, I kind of took it for granted, but then I got into my undergrad and I had an opportunity to take an ornithology course at Memorial University where I was studying. And what I found doing that ornithology course was that I was really good at sort of working with birds and identifying birds and all this. So my professor approached me and then said, would you like to come to Alaska and do some field work with me for the summer? So I jumped on that opportunity. And so I went to Alaska, out to the Western Aleutian Islands, and started working with Leach's storm petrel, looking at geographic variation in storm petrel populations, so how different they are between different areas. And that's what really made me fall in love with seabirds. I think after that, I was basically hooked. And I never left. So after my undergrad, I moved to Alaska, to Fairbanks, to work on storm petrels for a little bit longer. This is where I started really getting into statistics, programming, and distributions, and all this. I moved to New Zealand not long after that for my PhD, and then had spent some time in Texas, and then in California, where I was doing some work with albatross, and then finally to Stony Brook, New York, where I worked with Heather Lynch on penguins. And that's what got me into penguin counting. Now, I've since left New York and I've moved on and now live in Scotland, where I work with a company called High Def doing assessments of the the impact of offshore wind farms on seabird populations. However, I still do hold Antarctica very dear to me, very dear to my heart, and I do go back every year to work with Oceanites. I'll talk a little bit about Oceanites in just a second, but yeah, Ron often the person who runs Oceanites often refers to me as his head of science. So for that, I'll take that that title for this this talk. So throughout the talk, I'll just start off talking a little bit about Oceanites, the organization that I go down with. I'll talk a little bit about penguins because there are some people on here who might not understand exactly what a penguin is. I'll go over that. I'll talk a little about why we count penguins, when we go, and then the plan is to go over a typical trip to Antarctica. And what I'd like to do is really guide you on a journey from Ushuaia, Argentina, all the way to South Georgia, and then back down to the peninsula and back up. And the reason why I want to do that is because I want to show you what it's like at sea down there, talk a little bit about some of the seabirds that we see, and then talk about the importance of counting penguins, what we do with those data, and what that means for conservation and the understanding of the Antarctic ecology. I'll talk a little bit. I'll finalize everything talking about what you need to do to be a penguin counter. So how the sort of characteristics of a typical penguin counter, and also a little bit about what we're learning. So Oceanites. Now this fine man here that you're seeing in this image is a man named Ron Naveen. He's the founder of Oceanites. His background is actually in law. So he was a lawyer a long time ago. And in sort of in the 80s and 90s, he started going down to Antarctica and basically fell in love with the place and never left. So he gave up his career as a lawyer and decided to found this nonprofit called Oceanites that's focused entirely on collecting data in Antarctica to inform policy and management, conservation policy and management. Oceanites is the world's only nonprofit publicly supported Antarctic research program. That means that it's funded entirely by donations from the general public. Oceanites is in charge of the Antarctic site inventory, which is basically a big database, a big data store of penguin counts, or so colony counts from all over the Antarctic Peninsula. And I'll show you where that is in just a minute on a map. The Antarctic Site Inventory is sort of a collaboration between Oceanites and several other organizations, or several other university groups. So this includes the labs of Mike Polito, Heather Lynch from Stony Brook, and Tom Hart from Oxford University and their group at Penguin Watch. And Oceanites, so the people who go down and count penguins are generally students who work in some of these labs or experienced scientists. And those experienced scientists are generally come from consulting or environmental monitoring backgrounds. And yeah, most of us have been doing this for a fair amount of time now. Broadly, I can say that we've been counting penguins in Antarctica now for about 3 decades, and it makes up one of the longest time series of data that exists in Antarctica for any biotic species. So penguins, I'm sure this is the reason that you're actually all listening in today for. So the word penguin. Penguin derives from a Welsh word, penguin, whitehead. And this was actually applied to a species of auk, a flightless species of auk named the great auk. So it's a huge seabird. Some of you are probably familiar with it or read books about it. It's now extinct, but sailors used to call this a penguin because it had white patches on its head. Now, when they started going to Antarctica, they started seeing these flightless birds that were black and white. And the term penguin they applied to these birds because sailors, they were not particularly educated. So they just sort of thought that they were basically the same bird or very similar anyways. And the term stuck. Of course, the great auk is now extinct. And so penguin left the Northern Hemisphere and now is applied to our feathery comrades in the Southern Hemisphere. So what is a penguin? Now, I'm putting this slide in here because penguins are not fish and not marine mammals. Historically, there was a very short period of time when sailors used to think that penguins might have been related to fish or marine mammals and not birds. But in fact, we do know now that penguins are birds. They're just birds that have traded in flight for underwater flight or swimming. So penguins are flightless, like I mentioned. You know, they've traded in those big, beautiful flight wings, flight feathers for these really stiff flippers that allow them to navigate through the water really very rapidly. And because they've evolved to swim through the water, they've evolved these torpedo-shaped bodies. And you can see in this picture here what that kind of looks like. They look like really slim rugby balls, basically. And they shoot through the water very, very quickly. Now, this is a Gen 2 penguin. Gen 2 penguins can swim something like 22 miles an hour, which is absolutely crazy for a seabird. They've got these really small, shiny feathers that are really, really dense. And in fact, penguins have the densest amount of feathers than compared to any other bird. And the reason it's so dense is to keep them warm and insulated, right? So they're obviously, some species of penguin live in very cold places, but they're also diving very deep, spending a lot of time in the water. So they need that extra insulation to keep them warm. They've got these large webbed feet, as you can see here, and that's for swimming very quickly through the water. And then most species also have these really stiff tail feathers, and that's to keep them balanced when they're standing up. And you'll see kind of what that looks like in this next picture. You can see in this sort of list of penguin species here, you see what they kind of look like when they're standing up and how those stiff tail feathers might be used to balance. The other thing that all penguins have is this counter shading. So it means that they're white on the belly and dark on the back. And this is to avoid being eaten, basically. It's a way of avoiding predation. You can imagine being a predator, an orca, or let's say a leopard seal, swimming from above, looking down at a dark back against a dark background. You're probably not going to have as easy a time seeing the bird. And similarly, if they're up on the surface and you've got a predator underneath, like this, and looking up, you've got the white belly against a very bright sky, so it means it's difficult to see. So that's what scientists believe is the reason for this counter shading that we see in penguins. Now, I want to point this out because you'd be surprised at how often people confuse the Arctic and Antarctic. Penguins do not live with polar bears. I think I can't state that loudly enough. In the media, obviously, you'll see these Coca-Cola commercials where penguins are handing Coca-Colas to baby polar bears. And it's very cute, but it's not reality. In fact, penguins and polar bears are very, very separate. Polar bears live in the Arctic and penguins live in the Southern Hemisphere. And I say the Southern Hemisphere because you can actually get tropical penguins. So in the Galapagos, you do get a species of penguin that breed up there and sort of live up there. And even down the west coast of South America, as you can see, they're quite high, low latitude. So they're very, very close to the equator. So they're living in quite warm climates. All the way down and all around sort of like the south part of South America, Patagonia. A lot of Argentina has a lot of penguins. South Africa, of course, and Southern Africa in general, there are penguins that breed around the coasts there. Australia, New Zealand, and then a lot of sort of the sub-Antarctic islands. So these are the islands that are kind of in this near the Southern Ocean or around the Southern Ocean, where you get species like king penguin and some of the sort of feathered penguins, the erect crested penguins and macaroni penguins and those sorts. But the ones that we're interested in, and I'll talk a little bit more about these, are the Antarctic penguins. And those are the Adelie chinstrap, Gen 2, and emperor penguins. Those are the ones kind of on the bottom left of this map that you're looking at here. Those are the ones that we count when we go to Antarctica. Now, penguins, as you're probably aware, for those of you who've seen Happy Feet and various other documentaries about penguins, you'll be aware that they engage in a whole bunch of really interesting activities and behaviors. And one of those, of course, is probably one of the more well-known ones, is this pebble transfer. So this is where the one partner will pick up a pebble and place it on or near a nest, either to impress a partner or something of that form. And so here's an example of that. This is a Gentoo penguin, and here he goes. He's very carefully picking out a stone. He waddles up the beach and then places it very gently next to his partner, who's sitting on some very adorable chicks. And I'm not sharing my sound at the moment, but I will share my sound here hopefully soon, so you can get a listen to some of these birds. There's also, as I mentioned, they have these torpedo-shaped bodies. I just want to show you kind of what it looks like when they swim underwater. So this, I took this this video on a GoPro a little while ago. Let's see here now. You should be able to see. Here we go. You can see how they glide through the water almost effortlessly. There's some more here. There we go. It comes through. There'll be some that come up relatively close to the camera here now in just a minute. But you can see they flap their wings and they use their feet to guide themselves through. And it's really a very graceful swimming. Here we go. Beautiful animals. So you might be asking, like, why do we count penguins in the first place? So a lot of it has to do with climate change and the climate crisis. Now, you're obviously all aware, I assume, that the Earth has been warming very rapidly due to the influx of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But the hardest hit places in the world are the Arctic and the Antarctic. The Antarctic in particular, the Antarctic Peninsula, which is where we do most of our work, is one of the fastest warming places in the world. The wintertime average temperature has increased by 5 degrees Celsius in the last 60 years. And that's pretty massive, because when we talk about global climate change, we often discuss 2 degrees Celsius as our threshold for sort of like environmental breakdown. Whereas in Antarctica, they've already reached that threshold and doubled it. So we're seeing a lot of changes in Antarctica very, very rapidly. And so we count penguins as a way of monitoring that, as trying to make an assessment or trying to get an idea of how penguin populations are changing with environmental change. But there's another reason we count penguins, which is inverse of that kind of thing. And that is this idea that penguins are a canary in the coal mine. So if you don't understand what that saying comes from, it basically means that penguins are an indicator species. So we look at penguins as a way of telling us a lot about what's going on in the ecosystem. What we're interested in finding out is if penguins can tell us a lot about ocean health. And it kind of works, and there's a number of reasons why that is. But the most obvious, the reason that we kind of really hone in on penguins, we should say, is because penguins like Adelies, chinstrap, and gentoos, the one that we focus on, they sit in a place in the food web that's close enough to sort of like these lower trophic levels, so phytoplankton and krill, that the signals that we get from increasing temperatures and sea ice loss can be detected within the population. So by counting penguins, it tells us a story about what's going on in the broader ecosystem. So as temperatures increase and sea ice in Antarctica disappears for various because of that, that has implications, or it will change phytoplankton distribution, so where phytoplankton are found and where krill are found. And Adelies, chinstrap, and gentoos feed primarily on krill. And so the changes in krill and phytoplankton coming from climate change, we can detect in their population. So that's where we're at here. Now, the other interesting thing too about that is that krill and phytoplankton, and particularly krill, are a massive part of the Antarctic ecosystem. They feed almost everything down there, like whales, crab-eater seals, there's fish and squid that all eat krill. And so because we can count penguins very easily, knowing how their populations are changing because of the changes in phytoplankton and krill means that we can make a guess on how populations of whales, crab-eater seals, and others might be doing. So it really tells us a lot about what's going on in the ecosystem. So as I mentioned, we focus on 3 species. We do also work a little bit with emperor penguins. I'll talk about that very, very briefly, but this is through some colleagues, not necessarily stuff that we do, because there are only 2 penguin colonies or emperor penguin colonies on the Antarctic Peninsula, and they're very difficult to get to. So these are the 3 species. On the left-hand side, with that beautiful chin strap, is the chin strap penguin. In the middle is the Adelie penguin, which is a lovely penguin that you see all throughout. It's mostly up on land in southern parts of the Antarctic Peninsula, with some colonies up in the northeastern part. I'll show you a map here soon. And then Gentoo penguins with that lovely orange lipstick on the right-hand side here. Now, to get an idea of penguin populations and how well they're doing, we need to count them at the right time of year. And the reason why we need to do that is because we need to know how many adults are having babies. So what the breeding population is. The only way for us to do that is to go when they're sitting on nests. And we're actually really lucky that penguins breed in these really tight aggregations, these tight groups. And that means we can get to them and we can count the number of birds that are sitting on nests. And then we know from that how many adults there are. So for one nest, we have 2 adults. So if we count 100 nests, we know that there are 200 adults in that, 200 breeding adults. So 200 adults that can have babies in that colony. And the time of year that we really focus on is from November to February, because this is when the adults are stuck to the nest, basically. There either has to be a male or female sat on the nest at any time. After February, the males and females will go out to sea, and the chicks are big enough at that point that they don't need the adults around so much. So the adults start taking turns feeding them more frequently until they get big enough that they can fledge and go out to sea. So the time we're really interested in is sometime between November and February. So now that I've talked a little bit about penguins, what I'd like to do is take you on a standard trip around Antarctica. This is what I like to call there and back again. Now, apparently my Hobbit name is Balbo Goodenough, as I found out from an online Hobbit name generator. So there we go. So this is the part of the world we're heading to. This is, you can see it's that we're in sort of like the southern Atlantic Ocean, and up in the top left of this map on the right-hand side, you're going to see the southern part of South America. This is Tierra del Fuego. Then we've got the Falklands, and then South Georgia on the far eastern side or the far right side of that map. And down on the bottom is the Antarctic Peninsula. So this is that peninsula that sticks right up from Antarctica like a little hand coming up. And this is where we do all of our penguin counting. Now, you can imagine that there are probably not very many airports in Antarctica. So we can't necessarily easily fly down to Antarctica. And even if we could, and actually there is one small airport you can go to on King George Island, but it's only for like chartered flights, basically. So you still, when you get down there, you still need to get on a ship. And so what we do as penguin counters is we get on board tourist vessels, so tourist expedition ships that are going to Antarctica with passengers on board. So we use them as what we call platforms of opportunity or ships of opportunity. Now, Antarctica has had a huge influx in tourism over the last 2 decades or more. This is an old graph that you can see on the left-hand side here. This only goes to 2008, 2009. But in those years, you can see that there's about 34,000 people who visited Antarctica in 2008, 2009. That's increased dramatically since then. We're upwards of 50,000, 60,000 people, and that is projected to increase once COVID has passed. So we're looking at, there's a lot of ships going to Antarctica a lot of the time. And us in Oceanites, what we do is we get on board ships as lecturers. So we give lectures on board, we interact with the passengers. And as part of that, the tour companies, tourist operators who bring us down, they offer us berths on board, and that's been great. I have to say, we very, very much appreciate all of the effort and logistics that are put together by the tour companies that we work with, and yeah, we don't take that for granted by any stretch of the imagination. We would never be able to do what we do without cooperation from the people we sail with. So for those of you out there who might be listening within the tourism community who we've sailed with before, thank you very much. We do appreciate it. So a typical trip to Antarctica. Now this is like a typical long trip to Antarctica. Now, sometimes you can go directly from Ushuaia right down to the Antarctic Peninsula and then back. But what I want to do is take you on a trip from Ushuaia all the way out to South Georgia and then back down again. So this is kind of what a typical trip might look like. You come out from Ushuaia, out from South America, head north to the Falkland Islands, spend a couple of days there, head across down to South Georgia, spend a few days in South Georgia, then back down to Antarctica, and then across the infamous Drake Passage. So let's start in Ushuaia and the Beagle Channel. Now, Ushuaia is a beautiful little city, the southernmost city in the world. There's actually a Hard Rock Cafe for those of you who are into that sort of stuff in Ushuaia, which was quite a surprise to me the first time I went down there. But you can see Ushuaia is circled is in this red circle here. That's very, very far south and very remote. You fly in, it's right in the mountains, and the trip you take on your way out is you head out this what's called the Beagle Channel, and you sort of skirt along the Chilean and Argentinian border, and then head out to sea. Now, you land in Ushuaia. Ushuaia kind of looks like this beautiful little city hidden in the mountains. There's a Santa hat on top of the Ushuaia sign when you land there, if you're there at the right time of year. But this is where you actually start to see some really cool seabirds right away when you get to Ushuaia. So this species you're looking at here, this is southern giant petrel. You'll often find them basically right up next to shore. There's a couple of little outflows where there's some culverts that go out into the water, and you'll find southern giant petrel literally sitting right next to shore there. This is quite cool because these kind of birds you often associate with sort of being far out at sea. But yeah, so you get these birds right up close to shore. The other ones that you might see are these brown-headed gulls. You often find them in small flocks, kind of flicking along the shoreline. Then you get the Magellanic penguins. So this is where you start to see your first penguins, especially when you're heading out through the Beagle Channel. You'll often see these little guys poking their head up out of the water, checking you out. The other ones that another species you might see is the Chilean skua, which is a kind of a predatory or scavenger bird. You'll often find them kind of flying out somewhere along the coastline, but a little bit further out from the town. Sometimes you see them fly by, but yeah, you'll usually see those when you're out on the ship heading out. So let's leave the Beagle Channel now when we head out to sea. So this is the section between the Beagle Channel and South America and the Falkland Islands. Now, this is where you start getting into the really cool birds. So one of the more common species that you'll see would be the black-browed albatross. Now, the reason why you see them so commonly out there is because it's one of the largest population of black-browed albatross are found in the Falkland Islands. And there's been at least one time when I've been out there when we came across a flock of black-browed albatross that was so thick that we could actually see it on the radar from the cabin. It was incredible. I wouldn't even be able to begin to estimate how many birds there were in that flock, but it was unbelievable. Steeplejason, which is up on the northwest side of the Falkland Islands, is hundreds of thousands of birds, and yeah, it's spectacular. Spectacular place. Now, black-browed albatross, they can be identified by this they're the kind of a medium-sized albatross. They've got the black across the tops of the wings, this beautiful black eyeliner, a bright orange bill, and that little bit of lipstick right on the tip of the bill there. Really spectacular birds. You see them very, very often. The other species that you might see are these prions. These are very, very small little birds, and they're very, very difficult to identify down to species. So you're talking about like fairy prions versus slender-billed prions. You'd have to be pretty sharp to identify these in the field because they're moving very, very rapidly, and they're very small, and they look very, very similar. But we do see lots of those big flocks in thousands. The other really cool birds are the great albatrosses. So these are the wandering and then like royal albatrosses. These are huge birds. The wandering albatross has an average wingspan of 3.5 meters. So that's like, if you assume the average 5-year-old is about 1.1 meters tall, you could stack 3 5-year-olds on top of each other, and that still wouldn't be the full wingspan of an average albatross. So average wandering albatross. So yeah, really incredible. You really do see them out here in reasonable numbers. The other species that you see a lot of in this section are species that are very dear to my heart, and that is the sooty shearwater. I did my PhD on these guys, and they breed on several islands around the Falklands and also around southern part of South America. And you can see them in really massive flocks that are tens of thousands of birds. I've had experiences where I've been at sea on moderately calm days where you can actually smell them before you can see them. They have a very pungent odor. Spectacular birds. Okay, so we've gone through that section of ocean. We're now in the Falkland Islands. Now, the Falklands have a lot of history. I mean, obviously the war in the 1980s and that sort of stuff, but I'm not going to talk so much about that. I'm really interested in talking to you about the seabirds. There are some other endemic species to the Falklands, like the Falkland steamer duck or Cobb's wren, for example, that you can see on these trips when you get on shore. But like I said, I'm here to focus on the seabirds. So if you want to talk about those other species at some point, just drop me a message or an email. I'll happily chat my face off about them. So one of the first places you stop when you get to the Falklands is this beautiful place called West Point Island. It's on the northwest tip of the Falklands. And what's really special about this place is that you can walk from the shore all the way up to this beautiful black-browed albatross colony. And to give you an idea of how close you get to these birds, this picture that you're seeing here was taken by my phone without any zoom. I was literally just standing there with my phone held up to my face and snapping these pictures. You're basically right on top of them. The other really cool thing about this particular colony is that the rockhopper penguins, which you can see kind of standing up on that rock there, these birds nest in the rocks around the black-browed albatross. So not only do you get these really cool albatross, but you get penguins as well, standing right next to each other. Spectacular photo opportunities, and it's a beautiful place. The other thing that you can see in the Falkland Islands are these guys, the king penguins. So this is the first time you might get an opportunity to see king penguins. These are at Volunteer Point. It's a kind of a smallish king penguin colony, but if you've got some time when you're in Stanley, the main city, we'll say the town of the Falklands. If you've got some time while you're there, you can go and visit these guys. It's usually a couple $100 if you want to do a couple £100 if you want to do like a road trip up, or if you're lucky enough, your cruise may give you the time to go to this place. It is spectacular. Now, the other species that you find very commonly around the Falklands are Gentoo penguins. Now, if you remember, Gentoo penguins are one of the species of interest for us in Antarctica. Now, they obviously don't just nest in Antarctica. They nest in the Falklands and other sub-Antarctic islands. And these here in the Falklands, we do go through the process of counting them. And we do that even though we don't necessarily use the data for our work in Antarctica, we do store those data and we share those with other researchers and other conservation scientists who are working in the Falklands. We also share the data with the landowners, because the interesting thing about the Falklands is that a lot of these islands are actually owned by people. So the landowners are the ones who give us permission to go and count the birds there. And so when we do that, of course, we do this within our permits and conversations with the relevant authorities. But broadly, the landowners there are the ones that are interested in the information, because they don't do it themselves some of the times. So we share that information with them when we can, and have conversations with them. And so that's why we do it here. So let's leave the Falklands now and head towards South Georgia. So now we're out in this very large swath of sea here. Now, depending on the weather, this can take a fair amount of time to traverse this amount of ocean. However, I just want to point out that South Georgia is an amazing place for a whole number of reasons. One of those reasons is because of this blue line that you just saw appear on the screen is what's called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. And what that is it's an ocean current that separates the Southern Ocean from, say, the Pacific or the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean. It's a barrier. And anything south of that is really, really cold water. It's Antarctic water. And interestingly, right in front of South Georgia, that barrier goes north and goes around the top of South Georgia. So South Georgia, even though it's actually quite low latitude, so it's very far north compared to other places, it's actually got a lot in common with Antarctica because of the waters around it. So out at sea here, this is where you're going to see birds like light-mantled sooty albatross, which are one of my favorite albatross. They are beautiful, absolutely beautiful. These like smoky gray color, really narrow shaped body and wings, and this beautiful eye ring that you see here. Other species that you might see include the gray-hatted albatross, which you see down on the right-hand side here. This is a photo that was taken by a friend of mine named Camille Seaman, who's a spectacular photographer. Now these species are very similar in size to black-browed albatross, but you can see they've got these beautiful gray head. So yeah, you're really starting to see them along this sort of stretch of ocean. Now the other really cool thing about this stretch, if you're lucky enough, you can see this rock formation. Now these are called the Shag Rocks, and these are about a day's sail west of South Georgia. They're literally in the middle of nowhere, and it's this spectacular rock formation that sticks right up out of the ocean, and it's home to several thousand pairs of blue-eyed shag, which are a type of cormorant. And you can see actually in this picture, if you look at all that white on the top of those rocks, that's poop. That's shag poop. You'll also see a lot of whales around here and huge numbers of seabirds. Now, I'm going to try and see if I can share my sound with you here. Here we go. I'm going to share my sound because I have a video for you next. Sometimes if you're lucky enough and you go to this place, you might come across an aggregation of whales like this. You want to turn your volume down. And you can, if you listen carefully. Look. So what you're listening to is the sound of the whales as they come out of the water. And this is not something that happens every trip, but it can happen. This is a big, big pod of whales that came right up. We stopped the ship, and they completely surrounded us. Absolute pleasure to be able to witness this, and this is kind of the area where you're likely to see this kind of aggregation of whales. So, all right, I will stop sharing my sound. Okay, so now that we've left that section of ocean, we're in South Georgia now. Now, South Georgia is by far one of the most beautiful and amazing places on the planet for a whole number of reasons. But I have to say, going to South Georgia is such a pleasure because of the biodiversity, because there's so many different types of animals. And you also get not only different types of animals, but huge numbers of them as well. So some of the species that you get there are these beautiful king penguins. You see on the top left-hand side here, you'll see a little king penguin who's very interested in what I'm doing, very curious. You also get Gen 2 penguins. You see down on the right-hand side here, my colleague is expertly navigating around them. Now, what's interesting about South Georgia is all of this tall grass. Now, even though it's sort of Antarctic-ish, you do get these massive grass tufts. And that leads to a very interesting problem as a penguin counter in South Georgia, which is these little guys here. These are fur seal. Now they look like they would be not so much of a problem. However, for those of you who have ever spent any time in the field, you will know that fur seal can be incredibly dangerous. They chase you and they charge you and they can bite. And with the tall grass in Antarctica, especially as penguin counters when we're by ourselves, out working in the colonies, we have to be very, very careful about these animals. You have to learn a lot about how to stand your ground and how to avoid surprising them, which is often an issue. The young bachelor males are the ones that are often the problem. And much like with bears and other large animals, you just have to stand your ground and put something between you and the animal. That usually helps. But yeah, it's something that's often on our mind when we're down in South Georgia. Now, I want to show this video, and I'm going to share my sound again because this is a spectacular sight. This is this right here is St. Andrews Bay, and is a massive king penguin colony. The largest in South Georgia, one of the largest in the world, 200,000 plus birds. So here we go. I'll play this. You might be able to hear it here. You can see it's just absolutely just white noise in the background. But these birds here, they stretch all the way down this beach, down around the other side towards the glacier, all in through here. And these little brown lines that you see here, these are the babies. They call them oakum barrels, little brown, they're big brown chicks. Very, very cool birds. Now, interestingly, when you have a colony that's this big, you have to wonder, how do you count them, right? I mean, we obviously can't sit there and count those birds manually, so we have to come up with ways of doing it. So what we often do is, or what we used to do anyways, is to take pictures. You can see my colleague here on the left-hand side who's got a camera set up on a tripod. And what she's doing is she's taking pictures along the colony here to try and identify how many birds there are. We also use drones. I won't talk too much about drones. I'll have a slide about that a little bit later, but we do use drones to count these as well. Now, sometimes, in very, very rare cases, you get some very, very brave birds. Now, this is something that I have to say we don't get very often, but last season I had this experience. You can see most of these birds are pretty chill, they're relaxed, not really doing anything. For some reason, there was this one bird that just came at me. He was angry, and you could tell right from the beginning something was different about this guy. And so he came up and he decided that he was out for blood. And here we go. There we go. He's after me. And this guy obviously did not want me around in the colony. He chased me for about 10 minutes, and I'm pretty sure if I didn't have my GoPro on me, I'd probably not be, I'd still be in South Georgia somewhere, lost to this penguin. Absolutely wild experience. Okay, as much as I love South Georgia, it's time now to head towards Antarctica. So we come around the eastern side of South Georgia. There's a lot of really interesting species and story. I mean, there's a whole talk on South Georgia all on its own, but obviously don't have time for that. So let's head to Antarctica. So we head across this next big stretch of ocean here. Now, a lot of the species that you'll see going down this way are very similar to the ones that you'll have seen before. However, you will start seeing birds like blue petrel, and then you'll start seeing more and more of these guys, which are called Cape petrel. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my sound again. So these are Cape petrel or pintado petrel. You'll see them often in these little flocks following along the ship. They're these beautiful black and white birds. You can see their color patterning over the tops of their wings. Really delicate looking birds. I do have a story about how delicate these birds are, but that's a story for another time, perhaps. Yeah, so you see those, and then we get to Antarctica, get into the crux of what we're here to talk about now. This is where we're heading. This is the Antarctic Peninsula. I'll just point out, so if you follow my mouse on the screen, you'll see up here in the north, this is Elephant Island. For those of you who are familiar with Antarctic history and the story of Antarctic explorers, you might remember Elephant Island as the island where Shackleton and his men were well, not marooned, but where they ended up before Shackleton crossed the Drake Passage in his little rowboat, his little glorified rowboat, to get help in South Georgia. But this is where Frank Wild and the crew stayed while Shackleton was looking for going to get help. Down here, you've got the South Shetland Islands, and this is a set of islands right here. You've got where there's some very unique grass and such that occur here. Right here, you've got the Chilean base. There's a couple of research stations that are all right in kind of this area. The Chilean base here is where the aircraft land that I was telling you about earlier. So this is where that little airstrip is. And you can fly into King George Island and then catch a ship and then travel around the Antarctic Peninsula. But it's very difficult to fly in there because the weather is not always very good. Another point of interest here is this little half-moon shaped place, and this is called Deception Island. This is an active volcano. So this is one of the only places, I think it might be the only place in the world where you can sail into an active volcano on a large ship. So ships can go in here, and there's a lot of history around here and whaling and sealing in Antarctica. You can also do the polar dip here. Some companies will allow you to do a polar dip where you hop in the water and the like. Now, penguin colonies are kind of spread all throughout this region. In that we know of, there are 94 Adelie penguin colonies, 104 Gentoo penguin colonies, and 257 chinstrap penguin colonies. There are also 2 emperor penguin colonies. There's one emperor penguin colony over here on Snow Hill Island and another one way down south here on the Dion Islands, or a place called Emperor Island, which are very difficult to get to. It's often because there's just too much ice, so you can't get down there. So Adelie penguins tend to breed up here in the north area, or you find colonies down here with a few kind of scattered colonies in around this part, if you're following my mouse. You'll find Gentoo penguins that breed kind of all throughout, though they're focused mostly in through kind of this area with some colonies up in the north. Oops, I've skipped a slide by accident. And then chinstrap penguin colonies are kind of scattered everywhere with a really big bulk of them all along these islands here, from Elephant Island down through the South Shetland Islands out on the coasts. And you get them kind of scattered in and amongst the peninsula. So I'll just talk a little bit about some of the species you might see in Antarctica. On the left-hand side here, this white bird with the kind of grotty looking face, these are snowy sheathbills or pale-faced sheepbills. And these are really cool birds because they're not seabirds. They're the only non-seabird that lives in Antarctica all year long. And in fact, they're the only non-seabird that really live in Antarctica. But these guys, they live off of penguin poop, believe it or not. So they'll scavenge on this, that, and the other thing. But throughout the winter, when there's not much to eat, they will eat penguin poop and survive just fine on it. They are a very, very cool bird, even though people tend to underestimate them or don't look at them very much. It's kind of a shame. Up on the top here, you've got this beautiful, beautiful white bird with a jet black bill. And these are snow petrels. Often find them flying around ice formations, so icebergs and the like. On the right-hand side, you get Wilson's storm petrel, which breed down in Antarctica. One of the most widespread birds in the world, actually. You can find them in almost every ocean on the planet. The only place you can't find them regularly is the Bering Sea, but broadly you can find them everywhere else. The other ones that you get right here, so this is southern giant petrel again, but you'll notice that this bird is snow white. So this is what they call the white Nelly, or they're a white morph. So it means that they've got all white feathers, but it's just another morph or another color variation of the southern giant petrel. So, and they breed all through there. So of course we get Gentoo penguins. I'll share this little picture, this video with you here. This is on Cooverville Island, one of the largest Gentoo penguin colony in Antarctica. You can see here, it's got a wee chick that it's sitting under. In the background, you can see one of the tourist vessels that we often travel down on. I don't have my sound sharing at the moment, but yeah, this was a beautiful sunny day, taken from a GoPro. Then here's some Adelie penguins. This is I am going to share my sound for this actually, because this is kind of a nice one to share my sound for. Here we go. Here we go. These are Adelie penguins. This is at a colony called Brown Bluff, up on the north part of the Antarctic Peninsula. And you can see these guys. Unfortunately, this guy, this little bird decided to sit right in front of my camera just for a second. But it'll move in a minute, and here we go. And then you can see these guys coming at us. And you'll see some birds here that have some like orange on their bellies. They're not all beautiful and clean black and white like you see in the movies. That red is bits of krill that they basically, as they're feeding their chicks, kind of gets puked out over their chests. So they're not very clean birds, needless to say. Adelie penguins are quite cool because they do these things. They do this thing where they all go as a group right out to the end. And what we're looking at here in that video is these birds heading out towards the coastline or the shoreline, and they gather up as a group and they wait, and they wait for one bird to make the leap and go for it. It's a safety mechanism. They're basically looking out for a leopard seal. And so what they do is they get together and they wait, and when that one bird jumps, then the rest of them jump all at the same time. It's all very, very exciting to watch. They all try to skitter around trying to make their way out to the water. Okay, so on to counting penguins. Now, I've talked a lot about getting to Antarctica, and you might be asking yourself now, how do you count penguins? And well, the short answer is with this. This is this is the most important tool that we have as penguin counters. It's our clicker. And this is my favorite, one of my favorite sounds in the world. That's that, which is the sound of penguins being counted. And what we do is we use the old-fashioned clickers, pencils, and notebooks, where we stand in place and we count nests. So we count where adult birds are standing as nests. And what we try to do is we count a subgroup of birds, so a small group of birds, and we count them 3 times, and we try to get 3 counts that are within about 5% of each other. So for every 100 birds that we count, we want to get within 5 birds. So for a standard colony, it usually takes about 2 to 3 hours to do that by hand, but it depends totally on the size of the colony. The big colonies, when you're looking at over 3,000 birds or so, you definitely can't count those. And we usually go down in teams of 2. So it takes 2 people about 2 to 3 hours to count a colony that would be about 1 to 3,000 birds, depending on how good they are. Now, in the case of the big colonies, we do use drones from time to time. And here's an image here from a drone. What we do is we just fly over at a set height, and we do what's called transects, where we fly these lines back and forth across the colony. And then we put all those images together into a really big image of the colony. And then we can count from that using computers. The other way of counting penguins, which is something that our colleagues at Stony Brook University and one of our colleagues, Michelle LaRue, has been working on, is counting birds from satellites, so from space. And there's 2 ways of doing that. The one way is by looking at how much poop there is at the colony. So in this image here, you can see these big white patches. And what that is that it's penguin poop. And if you know how much penguin poop there is, and you know what the relationship is between the amount of penguin poop and the number of penguins, then you can guess about how many penguins there might be. So that's what's being done there. The other way is by actually physically counting birds from satellite. And that works really well with birds like emperor penguins. Now, this isn't emperor, you're not looking at emperor penguins in this image. This is actually an image from Port Lockroy that I literally took from Google Maps the other day. I zoomed into the colony as far as I could. And if you look in these highlighted areas up here, you see these little black dots on the screen. Those are individual penguins. With emperor penguins, which are much bigger, these are actually Gentoo penguins, in case you're wondering. With emperor penguins, which are much bigger, you can actually see them relatively clearly from satellite imagery, because there's big black dots on a background of white. So you can actually count emperor penguins from satellite imagery, which is very, very cool. And the work that Michelle Leroux, Peter Fretwell at the British Antarctic Survey, the work that they've been doing has been absolutely monumental for towards our understanding of how emperor penguin populations are doing around the Antarctic. So we're learning quite a lot through the 30 years of counting that we've been doing. And the real stories that are sticking out from that are these stories of winners and losers in the climate change battle. We typically say that Gen 2 penguins are climate change winners, whereas Adelies and chinstraps are climate change losers. And so that's because Gen 2s, their population is expanding very rapidly, their range is expanding, so it means they're spreading farther and there's more of them. Whereas Gen 2, chinstrap and Adelies, most of their populations are declining. Most of the colonies are declining. Gen 2s can colonize, which means they can go to new places very easily, but Adelies and chinstraps tend not to do that so easily. Gen 2 penguins also have this really kind of flexible laying pattern. So what happens is if they lose their eggs early in the season, they can relay again. So they can have more babies, or they can lay more eggs. But Adelies and chinstraps won't do that. If their eggs get blown out by a storm, washed away, or crushed or something like that, they'll just go back out to sea and won't come back for another season. Gen 2 penguins also have a less specialized diet. So Gen 2 penguins will eat things like fish and squid and stuff like that all through the year. Whereas Adelie and chinstrap penguins tend to be krill specialists. So they only eat krill. So if krill aren't doing well, then they won't do well. So it's all about this balance between flexibility and survival. And so Gen 2 penguins are really, really flexible. So it means that they're able to adapt. Whereas Adelie and chinstrap penguins, because they're not flexible, they can't adapt, which means that changes that we're seeing in Antarctica with these, rapid environmental changes really impacts the Adelie and chinstrap penguin populations. And here's another figure that we like to show. The global population of Gen 2 penguins, we're looking at about 387,000 pairs, whereas Adelie and chinstrap penguins were on the order of like 4.2 or 4 to 7.5 million pairs. So there are far more Adelie and chinstrap penguins than there are Gen 2 penguins by a long shot. But we do know that Gen 2 penguins, their populations are increasing very rapidly year after year. And it's going to be interesting to see where that goes as time goes on. So Oceanites has been actively involved with informing policy in Antarctica in various ways, shapes, and forms. So the data that we collect, we take to CAMLR. Now, CAMLR is the Conservation for the Congress for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And this is an organization that's made up of 27, I think, countries at the moment that are involved in preserving Antarctic life for science and peace. And the whole point is to foster collaboration across a number of countries that are working in Antarctica in order to allow people to do science in an active and undisturbed way. And what is quite cool about CAMLR is that, what's quite interesting about CAMLR is that in order to make a decision on protections, you require 100% consensus. So everybody needs to agree. That has implications if there are big political issues. Like, for example, if one country doesn't like what another country is doing somewhere else, then they can stop a particular conservation action from happening. This has been one of the issues with marine protected areas, for example, in Antarctica. However, the data that we collect goes directly to CAMLR in various ways, usually through scientific papers. So a lot of colleagues that we have that work in Antarctica, other scientists that are writing scientific papers that help inform policy, use the data that we collect and that we post online. You can actually view all of the data that we collect on our website, on one of our websites, penguinmap.com. It's got an interactive map, so you can explore penguin colonies all throughout Antarctica. And we have just over 3,300 records from 662 individual sites around the continent. Some of the work that we do as well has been used directly for fisheries management. So we work really heavily with the Association for Responsible Krill Harvesters, and we've been working with them to design buffer zones around penguin colonies to help keep them away from penguin colonies at important times of the year. So that's a year-on-year effort that we're involved in. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Oceanites and what we do, you can visit our website, oceanites.org. We publish every year the State of Antarctic Penguins report, which is an update on the latest population trends. And you can download those from the website. You can visit penguinmap.com as well and get all of the data for yourself. You can also explore the map. And you can also contact us if you want to talk about outreach. So, we do, school talks and the like. And obviously now with COVID, it's all very virtual, but we do love talking to school groups. And yeah, please do contact us at any time. We've also had a couple of pieces in the media for those of you who are interested in checking those out. We did a piece on NBC called Counting Penguins. We've got a film called The Penguin Counters, which stars our very own Ron Naveen. And if you can check that out, please do. It's very cool. It gives you a really in-depth look at the life of a penguin counter. Ron has got a self-published book called Ron Counts Penguins, and all the proceeds from that go to support Oceanites directly. And it's an ebook you can get. It's a very lovely little book for kids. The other one as well that you'll see me making a cameo in is this piece called Warnings from Antarctica, and that was on PBS NewsHour last year. So if you go to the web and search for Warnings from Antarctica with PBS NewsHour, you'll see the piece on climate change, just that talks about the work that we've been doing. So what does it take to be a penguin counter? Well, the first thing is to know your penguins, and not just know what species are what, but you have to know your penguins, be able to bring up factoids and discuss penguins and talk about them, to the average person in the street in ways that it'll be understandable to them. You also have to be sure-footed. So like I was talking about with fur seals, being able to know where to step, when to step. And also we're dropped off in remote locations that are have rough, rugged terrain. So we need to be good in the field and on our feet. The other thing is to not get seasick. Now, the one thing I did not talk about in this talk was the return trip from Antarctica to Ushuaia across the Drake Passage, the infamous Drake Passage, where you can often get 9 to 12 meter seas pretty regularly. And if you've ever been on a ship in 9 to 12 meter seas, then you know that it can be quite adventurous, we'll say. The other thing is to be a careful counter. You need to be very rigorous, be very careful in how you're counting. I know that might seem like an obvious thing, but actually it does take a fair amount of training to be able to identify the groups, to be able to count them accurately. That is very, very important. Talking to the public is also a big thing. We need to make sure that we communicate the messages that penguins are telling us about climate change and the ecosystem to you and to the broader public. So we need to be able to do that. Another major part about being a penguin counter is that you have to love the planet. You have to love what you're doing and understand why you're doing it in order to be a good penguin counter. The final thing, of course, is to be passionate and to absolutely give yourself to the trade. And that may include dressing as a penguin from time to time, as you can see in this fantastic image. But that is probably, in my opinion, the most important thing, is to be passionate about this. And with that, I will leave you with this lovely video of a beautiful Gentoo penguin feeding its 2 very lovely chicks that I took last season while I was down. Here we go, little babies. So everyone, thank you very much. And I will happily take any questions that you might have. And I will stop sharing my screen with that.
Thank you so much, Grant. That was a really, really informative and interesting and immaculately delivered presentation. So we really appreciate it. We do have some questions in the chat. I'll just read them out if that's okay.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Heather is asking, do the different kinds of penguins interbreed?
No, not in Antarctica. So you don't get hybrid Gentoo Adelie penguins, for example. There's some evidence that northern and southern rockhopper penguins, which are very similarly related species, breed in other parts of the world. But yeah, you won't get, say, a Gentoo and a chinstrap breeding, for example, at least not that's been recorded. So yeah, there's not very much interbreeding between the penguin species.
David is asking, can you be confident that you're not counting the same birds twice or more?
Yes. So fortunately, because the birds are sitting on nests, and we do a fair amount of training, we're pretty good at knowing which birds we've counted. We do have methods that we employ when we're in the field where we don't count like a massive group. We're not counting like 300 birds at the same time. We're counting small groups of, say, 20 at a time, and we mark these kind of like mental barriers around what we call subgroups, where we can count small groups of like 20 to 30 birds at a time, and then move on to the next. So it's and the birds, conveniently kind of align themselves really nicely to that. They often sit in these really tight groups, so it makes it really easy for us to count them, and not double count very often. It's not to say it doesn't happen, but we do our best.
And then I think the same person is asking, how are populations of the other species doing, the ones you're not counting?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, there's 18 species of penguin, arguably 19 depending on who you talk to, which taxonomist you talk to. But of the species that we do know, most of them are moderately are somewhat stable. There's some that are declining very rapidly, some that are endangered. So the yellow-eyed penguin, for example, are not doing particularly well. Emperor penguins, as we know, and actually we should find out relatively soon. There's a paper coming on emperor penguin populations that should be out soon. So we should actually get a reasonable idea. The last count of emperor penguins suggested that emperor penguin populations were declining relatively rapidly, but we should get a better idea of that with this new paper that's coming out soon. So as for the other species, I could spend probably an hour in here talking about the geographic variation in their population declines, because some species it's up and down depending on where you're at. It's very low. There's a lot of local variation.
And then Elizabeth, who's giving the talk on Galapagos, says she's planning to travel to Antarctica next year. How can she help?
Well, if you want to drop me an email, please do drop me an email, and we can have a conversation. Of course, I'd be happy to talk. I think I'm not sure if my email is in there. What I can do is I can pop my email. Do that right now. There. My email is now in the chat box. So if you do want to talk, please do drop me an email.
And then Swati is asking, which type of satellite images are used for penguin counting? How accurate is the satellite method for counting penguins?
So the satellite method is not as accurate. Depends where, it depends on the colony, depends on the topography. You can be 15% off in some places. You can be 20 to 25% off of reality. There hasn't been a whole lot of ground truthing. It's very difficult to do the ground truthing, and that's still kind of ongoing work. But the satellites that we're using are Worldview 3, which are high resolution satellite images. These are 31 centimeter resolution satellite. There is some stuff being done from other satellites as well, but that's kind of the one that's being focused on as an option.
And then Paul is asking, how many chicks on average do the penguins have, and what's their lifespan?
The lifespan is still not quite clear. You're looking at maybe 20 to 35 years for Gentoo, Adelie, and chinstraps, maybe. But as it is with most seabirds and most birds that live in remote places, we're always learning new things, and we're always finding that birds are actually living way longer than what we originally anticipated. As for the number of chicks, it depends on the species. Gentoos can have 2, sometimes 3. And in fact, I think in one case last year, it might have been maybe not last year, but the last season I went down, we found one Gentoo nest with 4 chicks in it. Now, 4 chicks, they're not all going to survive, but it can happen. Adelies and chinstraps tend to only have 1, maybe 2 chicks at most.
And Sendo is asking, is what Russia is doing in the Arctic and Antarctic negatively impacting the penguins?
Well, it's more than just one country that's having an impact in Antarctica. So Russia is just one country that have prevented the creation of marine protected areas. They have their reasons for that. But there are other countries as well that have interest in Antarctica with regards to krill fishing. And that krill fishing, whether or not it negatively impacts the ecosystem, is still being studied. There's still loads of work. It's very, very difficult to make the assessments. The biggest negative impacts that countries can have in Antarctica is around policy. And that's at CCAMLR, when countries step up and say that they're not going to agree to a conservation measure because of some, maybe political reason, or maybe some scientific reason that they might have. So that's often the biggest impact, rather than the act of, say, fishing or anything like that down there.
So, as a marine biologist, I have to say this, and somebody who's worked on fisheries as well. It's pretty hard to imagine those industrial fishing ships are not doing harm into the ecosystem. It would have to be the exception, because everywhere else in the world.
I think there's a number of reasons why the picture isn't particularly clear yet. And a lot of that has to do with krill dynamics. So krill are planktonic organisms. They can swim a little bit, but they're really at the whim of the currents. And so if you have populations that move like that, it makes it difficult to assess the biomass. Yeah. We do know that in early 2000s, there was an assessment of the krill stock of, I want to say it was 60 or 70 million tons or something like that of krill within the Antarctic Peninsula. When they did the reassessment, just last year, they found approximately the same amount. So the amount of krill hasn't changed. It's all about the distribution and whether or not local fishing efforts. So if you have one of these big like krill hoovers or vacuums going through the water, whether or not that's impacting local populations, that's the real question. And the problem is there's so many colonies and not enough researchers and not enough data being collected in a stratified and scientific way. There are colonies that are being investigated and studied, of course, and they're being studied very well, but it's very difficult to study everything that's down there and really get a picture of where these fishing vessels might be having an impact. There's a couple of studies that suggest there is, but it's not concrete yet.
Yeah, and it's difficult because I doubt that the stats are very accurate. So they're probably 12 million tons plus or minus 12 million tons.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah. There's a lot of variation around that estimate of the tonnage, because it's done by transects, and of course there's lots of issues around how you collect those data.
So Carla is asking, does software or machine learning help you with counting, or is this a future in your trade?
Yep, no, we actively use deep learning techniques to count penguins. I've written an algorithm alongside the British Antarctic Survey that we've been using for some stuff from aircraft. But we have colleagues in Chile, at Oxford, and in Stony Brook that are all using machine learning actively to count penguins from drone imagery.
Another Grant is asking, why is the count of gentoos much more accurate than chinstrap? Sheer numbers or spread of habitat?
Yeah. So the reason why we get better estimates of Gentoo penguins versus chinstrap penguins is actually driven by tourism, because we as penguin counters go down on tourist vessels, and tourist vessels go to easily accessible sites. The most easily accessible sites happen to be those where Gentoo penguins breed. So we just happen to get to Gentoo penguin colonies much more frequently than a lot of others. Chinstrap penguin colonies are very, very difficult to access. And it was only last year that a lot of the big chinstrap colonies were actually revisited. So a lot of chinstrap penguin colonies in through Elephant Island, the west, the side of the King George Island and the South Shetland Islands, the west side of those were just never visited. And they haven't been visited since like the 60s and 70s. And so we just don't have the information to be able to make accurate assessments. So when we model the populations, we're actually there's a lot of uncertainty around it. Whereas with Gentoos, because we can get to the colonies, they're not very big colonies, and we get to them frequently, we get really, really accurate counts because we're doing lots of ground counts there.
Okay, there's another question that deals with, is selling krill oil negatively impacting the availability for animals? I think you've already answered that, right?
Yeah, that's somewhat related to what we talk about. Obviously, krill oil is the driver for that, but krill is also used in, say, like fish meal and in food as well. So like dog food and the like, or animal food. So it's being used for a number of different things, but krill oil is the real big seller.
And Francisca says a number of things, but the most interesting one is that her favorite bit is inferring the number of penguins from poop.
Yeah, I got to say, the work that Heather Lynch and her lab have done on that work has been really, really cool. So that was actually all funded by NASA, and they had access to a lot of satellites. They could just task satellites and say, we want to look here. So they've done a lot of work on that. They're also looking at the spectral signature of guano at the moment, where you actually look at the color of poop using a spectrometer, and that gives you information about the diet. But you can also arguably feed that into imagery satellites. And what they're trying to think about now is how you might use that color as information to feed back to the satellites as to population health, or health of the population. Yeah.
Lippy is asking, how is Oceanites different from other organizations that do science and research in Antarctica?
So Oceanites, there are not any other non-governmental organizations or non-profits that are totally publicly funded by people like you who might donate. So there are groups. So WWF and Greenpeace fund research in Antarctica. Sometimes they bring scientists down to Antarctica to do research, but none of them are involved in long-term monitoring programs or anything like that. They are a lot of them are sort of like, they go down to do advocacy. So they do a lot of, say, filming and the like, which they bring back to the general public. They do a little bit of research while they're down there, but it's very like focused research. So they might go down and collect some, samples of this, that, and the other thing. But organizations like Greenpeace and WWF, as much as the amazing work they do, they are funded by, say, larger organizations as well. It's not all public donations. Whereas we've been working down there now for 30 years, completely on donations from the public now. And the other thing as well is that we focus solely on collecting data. And that's what we do, is we collect data, we do outreach, and we help to feed that data to the right people. Which is a little bit of a different model than what WWF and Greenpeace and other NGOs, or the other couple of NGOs that do some stuff down there, do. So,
Akila's asking, are you concerned about the increased tourism? Is there any impact in Antarctica, and what measures to minimize it?
That's a good question. It's one that comes up quite a lot, and actually there's been a growing body of research around that. And the suggestion so far is that tourism doesn't seem to have a major impact that we're aware of, at least no direct impact. So there's a couple of different ways that tourism could impact penguins. One is direct impact, where people show up on land and they scare a bunch of penguins off. In my experience going down there, you don't really see that. Penguins are there and they kind of wander around. Now, there are other more subtle indirect impacts that you might have, like stress, for example. So it might just, lots of people on land might stress them out, might lead to, disease, or, over time they just get kind of wary about being on land and this sort of stuff. But the evidence that exists at the moment suggests that that's not a major impact. The other really big way that tourism impacts the Antarctic ecosystem is through the introduction of zoonotic diseases, or the introduction of invasive species. So that's when people go down and they have, say, stuff on their boots, and it transfers into the ecosystem when they get down there. Now, most vessels that go down do a very, very good job of cleaning people's boots, and making sure that you don't take anything. And some companies, I have to say, I've sailed with some companies. The one I sailed with 2 years, last time I went down, were very, very thorough, removing all the dirt, all the bits of stuff that are in your boots. So when you go ashore, you make sure that you don't take anything with you. So the companies that are traveling down there, I want to say, are very, very responsible about those sorts of issues.
Okay, so now we've got Rox, who seems to be a student and is looking to do an MSc, and wants to know how a biologist can start working on penguin seabird related research. Has been trying to contact people for over a year and hasn't made much progress. My suggestion would be that she takes your email address and gets in touch with you, but maybe you have a short answer as well.
Yeah, no, it's it's a challenging environment at the moment because of COVID. A lot of field work has just stopped. So it's very difficult to get into new research programs that are doing interesting field work. If you're able to do any volunteering, then try and find opportunities to do some volunteering and increase your network that way. The other thing that I would recommend is to get on Twitter. And I know this seems absolutely silly, but there's a very, very large and active seabird community on Twitter. And so I run these seabird session Zoom groups where we discuss recent papers. You're welcome to join us on those and just meet new people, and network on Twitter. It's amazing how much that's made a huge difference to the seabird community. You can meet lots of really interesting people there. And of course, please do email me. My email is on the is in the chat there, and I can give you a more detailed rundown of some ideas for you, for sure.
Okay, I'm going to take two more questions, and then I think we have to close down.
Yeah, definitely.
So what are the physical aspects of penguins' feet that allow them not to freeze?
Yeah, so that's a not an easy question to answer for me because I'm not a biophysiologist, but if you notice, penguins don't really have knees, right? So they do, but you can see that their legs are very short. So there's not very much skin that's actually actively exposed to the air. When they huddle down in a colony, they sit on their feet, and their feet are completely covered by their feathers and a little bit of blubber they have. So that helps them when they're in the air, but when they're in the water, they're moving, right? So they're moving and their blood is circulating while they're in the water, which keeps them warm, just like us when we're, doing jumping jacks or running around, our extremities warm up because the blood is pumping through our system. So in a similar way, when they're moving through the water, you get that. And when they're on land, they just kind of hunker down and cover their feet up. There are other biomechanistic aspects to that as well in regards to circulation and all that in their feet, but that's probably what they do.
And then the last question, do penguins have nesting site fidelity, or can regional population variations be caused by penguins moving between groups or alternative nesting sites?
Yep. So Gen 2 penguins are a lower amount of fidelity than other species. So Gen 2 penguins tend to spread relatively rapidly. They can explore new areas and move in pretty quickly. The amount of mixing between other species, so Gen 2s and Adelies and chinstraps, is not as well known. Adelies and chinstraps, there's some evidence that there's some mixing between colonies, but it's not particularly obvious. It seems to be that they're pretty site faithful, so they will come back to the site where they were born, typically.
Okay, so I think that's it for the question. So there is one more that maybe you can answer quickly, which is, what's the Twitter handle?
Yeah, if you go to @seabirders. So at seabirders, you'll get to see a whole bunch of stuff come up on Twitter there.
So that's it. And thanks very much, Grant. This was a really interesting talk and lots of really good questions. And thanks everybody for asking such good questions. Great questions always also enhance the presentation. So thanks again. And yes, Grant, hopefully we'll see you again. You've got lots of other things to talk about.
I got tons of stuff I could talk about for sure. But yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a blast. It's been really fun. It's been a really great opportunity to talk on Earth Day too. So that's been great.
It's pretty cool. I wrote something about it this morning, but I completely forgot for the rest of the day. So yeah, thanks very much, and good night, everybody, and happy Earth Day.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye.